What we're going to do this morning is briefly, individually talk about the different projects and process that we go through in terms of working with and arriving at mixed media genre kind of storytelling for memoir. And so I'm going to start first. I'm Rebecca Ewan. I'm the one with the antennae. Mainly because I always feel like an alien no matter where I am. I'm always from somewhere else. And I'm going to go through and talk about the process of arriving at this, which is my latest draft of the memoir, which is in cartoons and free verse. And it didn't start out that way at all. It really starts with the story of a friendship between myself. I'm the one sitting on the car in the patch pants. That was like the only pair of pants I owned at the time. I had moved out of my house. I was 12. I had moved out of my house and I was living in a commune. And this was my best friend, the girl who's standing up. Her name is Luna. And actually, in terms of a form, it took me 40 years to arrive at this book and telling this story, even though I've been writing poems and drawing pictures I did that when I was 12, this poetry book that I made for Luna for her birthday. And I've started trying to move this out into the world, which is a little bit hard because a lot of poetry, literary magazines don't publish cartoons, and a lot of cartoon magazines don't publish poetry. So I usually arrive at the edge of everything, and it's a little bit challenging to find publication. So I'm just going to go through the steps of how I've come to this particular work. And I call this step 0 because I actually started putting together the PowerPoint, and of course I started with step 1, writing, because we're writers, and that's what step 1 is always, writing. But actually it's not. It's having a story. And so for me, this is a story that has haunted me for nearly 40 years because my best friend was murdered when she was 15. That's her. And trying to figure out how to tell that story, what the best story is, took a really long time to do. So the first thing I did, I tried to fictionalize it. I'm not a fiction writer. I have an MFA in creative writing poetry, and I have an undergraduate degree in math, and I have a master's in landscape architecture, none of which make me a fiction writer. But nonetheless, I didn't know how to tell the story, and it's particularly because it's in the 70s with a lot of drugs, and I had kids. And I didn't really want to tell the true story of how many drugs I did when I was young. And so I made up a story, and Luna turned into a guy and got me pregnant. It just got so twisted and strange. And then what happened in fiction, the reason it's really wonderful that I entered into fiction is that characters will sometimes take on a life of their own, and they just start telling you the story. And you don't have any choice, you just have to go with this story, which is a good thing because it took me away from the memoir. I was trying to press memoir into fiction, and I invented these characters that said, no, you're not, I'm not telling your story, I'm telling my own. And they became, and it ended up actually turning into a 4-book YA series, and it has time travel, and it was really a lot of fun and a lot of words for a poet. Each of them are between 60 and 80,000 words. And to date, I have just this one little scene from the 3rd book when the 2 characters kiss for the first time in a bookstore, of course, bathroom. But it taught me a lot about storytelling, and that was the most important thing. But it didn't resonate. I mean, I sent out a lot of queries. I didn't know what I was doing, and got a lot of rejections and felt kind of sad. And the thing about despair, and that is, I looked it up when I made that a couple days ago, my little graphic for despair, it is the absence of hope. So you kind of give up hope, and the nice thing about that is when you give up completely, your subconscious doesn't, Your subconscious is still in there going, you still have this really, this story that needs to be told. I'm going to go figure it out. You obviously don't know what you're doing. I'm going to go figure out the story, and then I'll give you some hints. And that's exactly what happened. It actually happened really, I was struck by, I did have an aha moment in this. So 40 years of not knowing quite what to do, and then I had that one aha moment. I was watching my son, who was 12 at the time, so it was my age when this story unfolded, and I was watching him watch TV, and he likes to curl up in a ball at the time, and he was so tiny, and I had forgotten that I was a really tiny person. I was extremely shy, and I realized that I needed to tell the story from that person's perspective, not 50-year-old wise professor. I had to tell it from my 12-year-old self. So I actually ended up deciding there's still going to be prose. I'm going to write this in first person. And I started to, and I didn't get it very far at all with prose. It immediately turned into poetry because of the voice. The voice needed to be fast and immediate. And so this is the first one of many drafts. And I still use drawings to help me kind of remember what I looked like, what life was like. Those are my patch pants. I still have them. I'm a hoarder, and finally I found like a good excuse to tell my husband, I need all this stuff. This is important relics of my history so that I can draw from them, literally. And so I was just using drawing to support my writing, and I still envisioned it as purely a work of poetry until I started drawing all over my poems. I would just be reading and editing the words, and I was like, okay, I can't figure out what's going on. I need some visuals, and I just drew all over my drafts, and that's really when the merging of cartoons and poetry started to work for me. And it took a really long time to figure out exactly how to do it. And these are just examples of some of the cartoons. And one of the nice things about comic art, cartoon art, is that it has so many different forms. You can do a lot with it. It's very much like poetry. Poetry, you can slow the pace down by doing couplets, or you can run everything together, you can lengthen the line. It's all about sound. It's very visual. Poetry is a very visual, it's on the page. And I think cartoons are as well. So you can make things kind of haunting, like that one in the middle about shadows, or funny. You can pack them, make them very dense, or do sequential art, like the one up, that's Luna giving me a letter after our friendship fell apart. And well, that was just a bad time in life, which is part of the story. And that was the other thing that I realized when I looked at my son, is that I don't need to tell the story about how a 15-year-old is murdered. That's not the story. The story was about her life and our friendship and the importance of friendship, and the murder was really the interruption of that. And so it kind of ends up, I don't know how many of you read Moby Dick and think it's about killing a whale, and then you get to like page 5090 and he finally finds the whale. That's kind of how the murder was, is that it's at the end. And it was really about, one, trying to create a legacy for this person who was really wonderful, and she's the daughter of someone who's kind of cult renowned. And so in cyberspace, she's only known as the 15-year-old daughter who was brutally murdered in a clothing store. And that's it. That's the only thing people know about her. And I wanted to change that. So the other thing that the pairing does that I think is really wonderful, I think mixed media has that opportunity, is that memoir in particular is really kind of a conversation between selves. It's your mature self, it's your present self, and the self that went through all of that stuff. And so I use the cartoons to sometimes be the grown-up person. Well, like in that picture of the guy he was my boyfriend at the time, and he was trying to convince me that he's not shooting heroin. And in fact, he was in his foot, which the reader can see, but I couldn't see as the child in that picture. And so it has opportunity to be, to like squeak a little of adult wisdom into the story. And then it went through a number of drafts. I finally arrived, this is just a couple of examples of little mock-ups that I do. I love comic books. I think it's a wonderful size. And so I laid it out to be like a comic book scale, because I think it's kind of intimate. And these are just a couple sample pages of what I'm working with now. So you have on one side the comic or the cartoon, and on the other side the poetry. And the other nice thing about poetry is that poems are short, unless you're writing epic poems. And so it can be pieced together, because I was only 12 and I was smoking copious amounts of marijuana, and memory is a little sketchy at times. But I'm a pack rat, so I had all of these remnants, and so it actually was a lot like my patch pants, where you have the real story underneath that starts to fall apart, and you patch it over until it becomes a new thing. It's a different thing. The thing I offer here is a true story. All of these things happened, but I patched them together in a way so that the reader can appreciate them in a different way. If I told every single detail, it would be, well, too long, and it wouldn't be very interesting. Oh, here's another one. So that's an essay that I wrote in school, and then I redrew everything. There's no photocopying, so that's redrawing, and I did give myself a couple rules. I could only use one kind of pencil. There's a lot of pencils out there, and you start drawing, there's way too many choices, and so I settled on the Ticonderoga Black #2, and I love that pencil. My grandmother was a writer, and it was her favorite pencil, but it wasn't the black kind, it hadn't come out yet. And so I'm sort of fond of the Ticonderoga, and so I used just that pencil, and it I think gave some uniformity to the images that I like. And I didn't have as many rules about the poetry, except it's present tense. So I couldn't add in anything that she wouldn't know as it was happening. And that's the final book. I was going to tell you how many poems it is, but I've forgotten, because I keep sticking them in. The only place I actually mix the poetry and the writing is at the very last page. I grew up on albums, and I love album art, and the Blue Skies, Allman Brothers album, was like my favorite thing to hallucinate on. It's just wonderful. And so it was the only time that I allowed the drawings and the poetry to touch, because I think they need to be alone but next to each other, and they resonate and create energy. That was a lot of what my relationship with Luna, because she was so different from me. But we became became a thing together because we were so close. And that's my story. So thank you.
So when I was 36 years old, I went to the doctor. I was pregnant for the second time, and he said, "You have a geriatric pregnancy." And I said, is anybody going to be offended by cussing? And I said under my breath, "Fuck you, I am 36 years old. That is not a geriatric pregnancy." And he said, "Well, there's a chance the baby has Down syndrome. You are 36 after all, you should get an amnio." And it's a long story, but I decided not to. And woke up in the recovery room, and my husband was measuring our newborn's ears. And I said, "Why are you doing that?" And I'd had so many drugs, I kept demanding them. And he said, "It looks like she has Down syndrome." And I closed my eyes and went to sleep for as long as I could. And in the end, Sophie had it. Sophie was the first person I'd ever met with Down syndrome. And it took 4 months to get in to see the geneticist. And I thought the geneticist was going to have all kinds of crazy, amazing answers for us. Exactly how she got it, why she got it, what sort of case of Down syndrome she'd have, which, none of those things can really be answered. And so I sat there thinking, I gotta ask something that makes sense. And so I asked whether or not people with Down syndrome ever have curly hair. So you can see in that picture, my husband, he's cut his curls since, but my husband and I and our daughter Annabelle, who was then, how old was Annabelle when Sophie was born? Like almost 2, all have curly hair. And it's a big deal in our family. When I was growing up, I blew my hair straight and I tried to do the Farrah Fawcett thing, and I was a total nerd, and it turned out my husband's mother blew his hair dry straight, and when I started to work on this memoir, I said, so, like super casually, like, so when did your mom stop blow drying your hair? And he's a journalist too, and he just stopped and stared at me and said, I know you're gonna write about this. I am not saying a word. So anyhow, curly hair was a big deal for us, and when Annabelle was born, our older daughter, you know, we stared at her head waiting for curls, and they came in, this huge, huge head of curls. And so I wanted to know that about Sophie. And like I said, I'd never met anybody with Down syndrome before, but I had like this vague recollection that people with Down syndrome didn't seem to have curly hair. And no, the geneticist said people with Down syndrome don't. Maybe, he said, maybe African-American hair, that's how he put it, will curl a little bit. And so of course I asked why, and he didn't know. And that's a picture of a karyotype. That's Sophie's karyotype. She has a 3rd 21st chromosome. That's what Down syndrome is. So to back up a little bit, I grew up as a journalist, and I only ever told other people's stories. And when I went to a fancy graduate school, they made a big deal out of how you never write about yourself. Nobody gives a shit about you. It's all about the story that you can tell. You don't even write those stories where you say, you know, the murder suspect said to me, blah, 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 because that takes the reader out of the story and it puts you in it in a bad way. And then when I came to work, where I've worked most of my career at New Times, which is the alternative news weekly in Phoenix, there's probably one in your city. I was told again, you know, particularly by the elder writers, you never write about yourself. That's just completely forbidden. And so I was very happy telling other people's stories. And the last big project I did right before Annabelle was born was about juvenile corrections and all kinds of mismanagement there. So that's what that logo is. But then Sophie was born, and I needed to figure out how to tell our story. And so I had this weird thing when she was born where I didn't really want to know much about Down syndrome. I wanted to know about the curly hair thing, but it was sort of I don't know if you've had like a big life-changing thing, but it was kind of on a need-to-know basis, right? So I could get her what she needed within that day, within that week. I could make the doctor's appointments, get the therapies, get things done for her, but I just sort of couldn't take it beyond that. And somebody at work who was really trying to convince me to blog at work said, here, we'll set up a blog for you about your daughter. So I thought I would document her kindergarten year. That's what that started out doing. So I wanted to call the blog originally Chocolate Dance Party, because I thought that was really cute, because Sophie was really into dancing and chocolate. But Deborah over here said, I really think you should Google that phrase before you name your blog. One of the many things I'm grateful to Deborah for. Yeah, that was a bad idea. And also, if you Google the name Sophie Stern, which is Sophie's name, there's a Scottish dominatrix who's very, very well known, who shares her name. I didn't find that out until after she was born. And so what I did, because I couldn't deal with the information. I could profile abortion doctors who carried guns, and I could write anything you want to know or don't want to know about John McCain, and I could write about social welfare and all kinds of scientific stories. I could not tell you what was wrong with Sophie's heart. My whole brain would just shut down. And so I decided to start reporting her story as a journalist. So I made what I call a story box. At New Times, we write these obnoxiously long 5,000-word cover stories, and you used, in the old days, you would get like months to work on them. And so I would take an old box, like a box that printer paper comes in, and I would start files for stories. And that's what I did with Sophie. And so for years, I collected all kinds of notes and information. Just like I would for any story. And I also kind of obsessively collected books, movies, anything. I have old sex pamphlets about mongoloids, which is what people with Down syndrome were called in the early 20th century, all kinds of stuff. And I did some radio pieces, I did some national radio pieces and some local radio pieces and some spoken word pieces, and I actually convinced my editors at New Times to let me write some stories that involved Sophie. Actually, I did not do that. I was an editor at that point because after she was born, they said, we don't really think your schedule will hold up to being a full-time writer anymore, so why don't you be an editor, which I bristled at, but ended up being a really great thing. And so I would just present my boss with my story and say, it's done, and also we're on deadline. There's like a day before publication, so he would just read it and print it. And so it would end up being kind of an alternating version of my story and Sophie's, or the reported story and Sophie's. And one of the stories I did recently was about a new kind of Special Olympics called Unified, where they take people with special needs and then typical people, kids usually, and put them together to compete, which is a really unique form compared to the traditional Special Olympics. So I talked about Sophie's experience doing it, juxtaposed with the history of that, and then shoved it down my editor's throat. And then I, a while ago, decided that I would like to write a book about Sophie, and so I put together a proposal and pitched that. And this last, October, in April, I got a book contract with a small house called Woodbine, and so this is what I did all summer, called Butt in Chair, right? And I wrote and wrote and wrote. But of course, before that, I had a lot more reporting to do. And if you have a journalism background, you know that there's no crack better than that, right? Like, oh, I'm sorry, I got to make a list of all the people I have to interview before I have to write. And so each chapter kind of takes on a different topic. And this is a family portrait that our older daughter Annabelle did. We still all have curly hair to some extent. It's not the best day for me. In our house, except for Sophie. And Sophie now wants to know why she doesn't have curly hair either. And I spent a lot of the summer finding scientists to ask about this. I found hair anthropologists, I found people at the CDC, all kinds of geneticists, and everyone told me that I was crazy and who cares and it doesn't matter. And I also did find a few people with curly hair who have Down syndrome, but there's definitely a connection there. The hair anthropologist actually said she'd never thought about it and thanked me and said it would be a few years, but she would definitely get back to me with an answer. So I was happy about that. Thank you.
My name's Deborah Hilary Sussman Soer, which is a really weird name, but I was born Deborah Hilary Sussman, and this is me and my dad. This is Denver, probably 1965. I am a first-generation American, the child of two Europeans. My mother was born in England in '36, the daughter of an Anglican priest. Came to the US in the 50s after the war. And my father was German Jewish, born in Berlin in 1928. It was not a great time to be born Jewish in Berlin. It seemed like it. The first 5 years were awesome. My father and I got along splendidly. He was my champion, my hero, and the person who really seemed to understand me best. And even as a child, I knew there was something dark. So did my brothers. We didn't really know what. We had perfect childhoods, lovely childhoods, but something wasn't quite right. And when I was about 10, I came across a Time Life book that had pictures of piles of bodies, black and white pictures of piles of bodies. And I asked my father about it. I think I had an intuitive sense that this might be part of his story, and he explained. And he said that was a concentration camp, and he had been in a concentration camp, which was very difficult, almost impossible to wrap your brain around I mean, at any age, but certainly as a child. So when I was about 16, must have been my senior year of high school, a visiting poet came, and we were supposed to rotate through as classes, right, with the visiting poet. And the visiting poet, who was super groovy, he had like, a hat and boots, and he was like, I want you to write about the most traumatic thing that ever happened to you. So the most traumatic thing that ever happened to me happened to somebody else. So this is my father, and that's the notebook he kept in the camp. He was in First Westerbork, which was a transit camp in Holland, and then he was in Bergen-Belsen. And the notebook survived, and it's in the Bergen-Belsen Museum in Germany. So this is something that the Belson people put together. It's a kind of book of survivor stories. So I told my father's story, but I told it from my vantage point, from a child's vantage point, because I didn't know how else to do it. And I don't know if you guys can read that, but basically it's, you know, a 16-year-old wrestling with what happened and writing around what happened, right? So talking about the thing that was missing in my father's childhood, because that's sort of all I could understand. And the poet really liked it. He thought it was great, and he made me stay and like read it to the other classes rotating through, which must have really pissed them off. But I was like, wow, I've got this. I've totally got this. I can do this. And then I failed. Pretty much every poem I tried to write about it after that failed. I don't know whether it's because this was a first attempt. I don't know whether it's because I tried to write about it head on. We visited the camps with my dad. There's not much there. It's mostly green grass. And so I was trying to write about how weird that was, but it didn't really work. And this is what Theodor Adorno said. It's a very famous quote, and he later backed away from it, right, and said, no, you can write poetry, but there was a kind of period where really it seemed like, how do you write about that? How do you put the unspeakable into words? And once I knew better, I felt wrong about doing it, right? I just felt like I was never going to capture it. My father sent me this card. And I think that was his way of saying, I understand what you're doing, I approve of what you're doing. He never had a problem with my writing about, you know, his history. He said he didn't tell us about it when we were children because he wanted us to have childhoods, because his had been taken away. So it wasn't that he wouldn't talk about it or couldn't talk about it. It was really that he was protecting us. And the thing we disagreed on was how to tell the story. So this is Mouse. This is a panel from Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which I thought was brilliant. I felt completely liberated by it, right? Because here was somebody telling this very, very difficult story in this unconventional way with pictures, making it his own. It was irreverent, but it was also incredibly respectful and true and deep. And my father did not like it. For him, it was a comic book, right? You don't tell these stories in comic books. That's just, the juxtaposition of those two things was not something that he could really get behind. So I went off to graduate school, really still not sure about, I worked as an editor in New York for 6 years, and then I went off to graduate school to write. And this was the story I was supposed to tell, right? This was the story that people wanted to hear as soon as they found out, like, my dad was in a camp. It's like, you have to write that story. So I tried it numerous ways. I don't draw particularly well, so first I tried memoir, then I tried kind of, it was memoir pressed into fiction was what I was trying to do, but that didn't really work either. It's interesting, I felt like people liked it, but it didn't feel true to me. And my father and I agreed that we were going to work on something together, right? He wanted to see more of me in the story. He felt like I kept trying to write his story, and where was I? I needed to be in it. And I couldn't figure out where I fit, why I was at all important, right? Because I hadn't done anything. We agreed we would write something together, and I interviewed him. So I tried to approach it as research. It's interesting, you know, Amy said the mind sort of refuses some facts. I had heard my father's story. I knew the dates. I could not retain them. I couldn't tell you when he was picked up. I couldn't tell you the various places he'd lived. And so I had to research it like it was somebody else's story. I had to interview my father. I had to go over the dates like I was studying for a test and kind of get that in my head. So in the middle of all this, my father was diagnosed with aggressive prostate cancer. He was 64. And it really didn't feel like the time to be pressing him. Survivors, when they're older and when they're sick, the memories tend to come back, and it's very difficult for them. So I really felt Like I wasn't helping him by pressing him on this stuff. But I had people saying the Holocaust is really hot right now, so you should really write this book, which just made me want to run away. I mean, that's a horrible thing to say. Sort of like your story, you need to tell your story right now because we can market it. And this was like early 90s or something like that. So then my dad died. And I really didn't know where to go from there. Shortly thereafter, I got married and kind of threw myself into that. I had a child. I kind of lost my voice. I really didn't write for almost a decade. Then I got divorced, and I needed a job. And I found a job as a reporter and editor, which I had never done before, but they seemed to think I could do it. And I had Amy to consult. I was like, Amy, how do you do this? And because I knew about the Holocaust survivor sort of experience, I became the go-to Holocaust person. So this was kind of what I got to do, was go out and talk to Holocaust survivors. And in doing so, it helped me gain perspective on my story and my father's story, to know that there were so many different sort of versions, right? It wasn't just my father's story. There were lots and lots of people who'd been affected in lots of different ways. And understanding, so my father was a child survivor. That's different from, people who were adults when they went through it. And so I wrote a number of pieces, basically journalism. But it was kind of touchy-feely journalism, it was really, right, it was storytelling, basically. I also did some radio pieces that were, kind of talking about my father's experience and about being half-half, and all of that really helped. The other thing that really helped is Mothers Who Write, which is a class that Amy and I co-teach. But I took it before I taught it. I took it for a couple of semesters, and it really helped me find myself and my voice after being a mother. When you have a kid, especially as a woman, sometimes you kind of forget who you are. And so Mothers Who Write brought me back to that. And it was also a place to talk about difficult stories. And over the years of teaching the class with Amy, we've been teaching for a long time, we sort of learned that it's therapeutic. It's not therapy, but it is therapeutic. And it's a place to bring these stories out. And we have the students read their work out loud, which is really a critical part of the process. When they hear their voice out loud, it allows them to edit their work in a way that they can't when they're just reading it on the page. So there's a kind of insight when you turn the marks on the page into sound and deliver it to a room full of people who are looking for meaning. And sometimes you have to get at difficult things obliquely, right, rather than head on. It's sort of what I did instinctively with that poem when I was 16. I'm going to write around this thing. One of our students, Cynthia Clark, who is an amazing writer, lost her daughter. Her daughter was having difficulty, and it was suggested to Cynthia and her husband that they send her away to wilderness camp, and she died there soon after arriving. So Cynthia didn't write for a while. I think, again, it's like, how do you first off, how do you internalize that story even, and then how do you tell it, right? And so sometimes you start small, and with Cynthia, I think it was drawing pictures. I mean, we usually draw pictures before we even write. That's something that's very almost instinctual, right? You draw pictures. So Cynthia drew pictures, and Cynthia started making comics, which I think is something she'd never thought she might do. And so this is a comic that Cynthia drew, Gray Area, which is all about the survivors of the children and how they grapple with that loss. I don't know, can you guys read it? Can you read it from back there? Yes? No? Yes? Okay, so I'll just tell you very quickly. So basically, I wonder why I address you in these pictures. So it's Cynthia addressing her daughter Erica and saying, why am I addressing you in these pictures, and what do I think is going to happen, and do I think you're there, right? And this middle panel is, Erica talking to her. I'm up here, Mom, right, with the butterflies. And then the dark panel is, or not. What if you're not up there? And so getting in pictures, that's something that is very, very difficult to get at in writing, or get at all. And Cynthia also used photographs, and she used, these are little newsletters. So essentially what happens is the group puts together these newsletters, and the newsletters are for the lost children, right? And it's written to the lost children. You know, here I am, this is what's happening. And so Cynthia's question is, do our children know what's going on with us? Are you always there? Or do you have to read about us in a newsletter or a comic book? So that's, and she calls it the gray area. So trying to get at something about what happened that you can't really do just in writing. It's a little bit what Rebecca was saying about using pacing and then also using photographs, using remnants, using artifacts, right, to get at the stories. So I tried to do that. I belong to a collective in Phoenix of mostly artists, and then there's me, the token writer. And so this was a piece of work I made for a show. And it doesn't work, but here's what I was trying to do. So that's a photo of my dad on a bicycle in Amsterdam before everything went to shit. And the poem that I wrote, Bergen-Belsen poem, is printed over that. And then it's interrupted by this quote from Flaubert that I used to keep up in my cubicle at Scholastic. Language is like a cracked kettle on which we beat out tunes for bears to dance to, while all the while we long to move the stars to pity, which is how I always felt about writing and about trying to get to my dad's story. And it sums up the distance between what we want to do and what we can do. So here's kind of what I'm doing now, which is a strange thing. When I was at Jewish News, I found out about a synagogue that had been co-founded by a Holocaust survivor in Phoenix in the 50s after the war, and it was going to be destroyed. And so I enlisted a friend who's a restorer of buildings, kind of a savior of buildings, and he ended up rescuing the building. So this is the building and its Facebook page, and I've been trying to tell the building's story. The photograph that you see is Fred Loewy. He's the son of the guy who co-founded the synagogue, who was known as the Jewish Schindler. He rescued thousands of French Jews. It's an incredible story and has not been told, and I feel like I can tell it because of my father's story, and my father's story can enter into that somehow. We had an event at the synagogue, which is not fully restored, but we had a Rosh Hashanah event, which is Jewish New Year, and this is Fred Loewy's grandson. Their great-grandfather, Elias Loewy, co-founded the synagogue. Steven Spielberg was also bar mitzvah there. And so then this is just to come back to my father and not really knowing how to tell the story. This is Amsterdam. I doubt it's 39, although that's what the photograph says. And that's another issue with telling this story, is the pieces that you have are not always reliable, right? People's memories, especially in that trauma, are not always reliable. The photographs don't always have the right dates or places written on them. I suspect that this is closer to 41 or 42. You know, I'm still really figuring out how to tell my father's story, and how, again, I was thinking when Rebecca was talking, it's like rescuing Luna, right? I mean, my father has become part of this narrative where my father's not in it at all. You know, my father went to school with Anne Frank. My father's parents knew Anne Frank's parents, right? And so I've had people say to me, oh my God, you're so lucky. It was well-meaning, I promise you. They didn't even think about what they were saying. But what I want to write is something that helps people understand why that's not the thing to say, and that sort of rescues my father and his history for my daughter so that she knows more about him than just that. Thank you.